My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 34 years old and I work as a pediatric physical therapist at a children's rehabilitation clinic outside Columbus, Ohio. The first time my neighbor called the police on my 7-year-old son for playing tag in our own front yard, I was standing 30 feet away, folding a basket of laundry on the porch, and I didn't even hear the cruiser pull up until its lights caught the side of the house. That was October of last year. By then, Gary Pruitt had already fined us for sidewalk chalk, reported our trampoline to the county, filed at least 6 formal complaints with our homeowners association, and taped more typed notices to our mailbox than I'd bothered to keep count of. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story, because it matters for everything that comes after it. My children were never doing anything wrong. Not once. They were being ordinary, loud, chalk-stained, tag-playing children in their own yard. Gary Pruitt had simply decided, for reasons it would take me nearly 5 years to fully understand, that our family was a problem that needed solving. I didn't know that yet, standing in my driveway that October evening with a deputy's business card in my hand and my son's face gone pale and blotchy in the back of my mind. I just knew something in me had gone very still, in the particular way it goes still right before you finally stop giving someone the benefit of the doubt. What I also didn't know yet was that Gary had already made his first real mistake, not the kind of mistake you apologize for over the fence, the kind you write down without realizing someone else might read it one day. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened to me, which means starting slower than you might expect for a story with a police cruiser in the first 2 minutes. Because the truth is, nothing about what Gary Pruitt did to my family looked dramatic while it was happening. It looked, for most of 5 years, like nothing at all, like the ordinary low-grade friction of living next to someone particular about lawns. That's exactly what made it work for as long as it did. If you're new here, welcome, and if you've ever been the one absorbing someone else's grudge and calling it keeping the peace, I think you're going to recognize a lot of yourself in this one. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and if these quiet justice stories are your thing, go ahead and subscribe now, because this one takes a while to turn and you'll want to be here for it. Let me take you back to June of 2021, the week Mark and I moved into 214 Larkspur Court, in a subdivision on the north side of Columbus called Maple Hollow. It was the kind of neighborhood that photographs well for a real estate listing, matching black mailboxes, a shared retention pond with a little arched footbridge nobody ever actually crossed, an HOA newsletter that came out on the first of every month whether or not anyone read past the pool schedule. Mark is a structural engineer, steady and even-keeled in a way I've always relied on more than I probably admit out loud. I was 7 months into a new position at the clinic, building a caseload of kids recovering from surgeries and injuries, the kind of work that teaches you patience whether you want it or not. We had Theo, 2 years old at the time, all elbows and curiosity. Ivy wasn't born yet. We'd bought the house mostly for the school district, and partly because the backyard backed onto a stretch of undeveloped woods which felt to 2 people who'd spent their 20s in apartments like the height of luxury. 2 doors down, at 210 Larkspur, lived Gary and Carol Pruitt. Gary was 61 that summer, a retired insurance claims adjuster with 31 years at the same company, and though no one had elected him to anything, the self-appointed keeper of what he liked to call the character of the street. He knew the HOA handbook by section and subsection the way some men know sports statistics. He mowed his lawn in perfectly measured diagonal stripes and edged his driveway with an actual level, not a metaphor, an actual bubble level, which he showed Mark once, unprompted, in our second week there. I want to give you 3 specific memories from that first year because they tell you almost everything you need to know about who Gary was, long before any of this started in earnest. The first, our second week in the house, Mark left our recycling bin at the curb about 4 hours after the truck had come through. Gary walked it back up our driveway himself and set it beside the garage door. "Just so you know the schedule," he said, pleasant enough, "Tuesdays, bins gone by 6, city ordinance." At the time I actually thought, what a conscientious neighbor. I remember saying that to Mark that night, almost admiringly. The second, that same July, Carol brought over a plate of lemon bars to welcome us, standing in our kitchen in a floral apron with flowers still on one wrist. While she was still there, Gary appeared in our doorway without knocking, to inform us that the previous owners had, in his words, let the gutters become a mosquito situation, and he hoped we'd keep up appearances a little better than that. Carol's smile didn't move when he said it, but her eyes flicked down and sideways just for a second in a way I didn't understand yet. I would understand it later. The third, at the 4th of July block party that first summer, someone, I think it was a man named Doug from the corner house, asked Gary, half joking, why he'd never actually run for a seat on the HOA board since he clearly knew the rules better than anyone currently on it. Gary laughed and said, because the board doesn't actually enforce anything. Somebody has to keep this street honest. Nobody laughed along with him, but nobody argued with him either. They just sort of nodded and moved the conversation somewhere else, the way you do with a smoke detector that chirps at 3 a.m. Annoying, but nobody wants to be the one who takes the battery out in case there's ever an actual fire. There's a fourth memory I should give you too, because it sets up something that matters much later. That same autumn, a family 2 streets over, the Kowalskis, whose kids were a little older than Theo, sold their house after 18 months of what they described at the time as just needing more space. Carol mentioned to me once, almost offhandedly while we stood at her mailbox, that the Kowalskis had actually gotten 3 separate code complaints in their final year on the street, all filed anonymously, and that their house had sold within a week of listing to a buyer represented by an agent none of us on Larkspur Court recognized. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I filed it away the way you file away a stranger's bad luck, sad but not yours. I would think about that conversation very differently years later, standing in Gary's garage. I should say a little about why all of this took me as long as it did to see clearly, because I don't think Gary alone explains it. I grew up the middle of 3 sisters in a house where the loudest person usually won, and I made an early, mostly unconscious decision somewhere around age 9 that I would rather be the reasonable one than the one anybody had to manage. My older sister fought for everything: curfews, car privileges, whose turn it was to do dishes, and got most of it. My younger sister cried until things went her way. I found, without ever really choosing it on purpose, that being easy got me a different kind of reward. Nobody worried about me, nobody had to brace for me, and for a long time I mistook that particular kind of invisibility for being loved well. It took me until my 30s, honestly, until a man 2 doors down spent 5 years quietly testing exactly how far that pattern could be pushed, to really understand what it had cost me all along. Mark grew up differently, an only child of 2 parents who argued everything out directly, sometimes loudly, and always resolved it by dinner. He still, to this day, finds my instinct to avoid conflict a little bewildering in the gentlest possible way. Just tell him no, he used to say in the earlier years about the chalk, about the hoop, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed that it wasn't that simple for me, that saying no to someone like Gary required something in me to shift first, something that had been sitting quietly in place since I was 9 years old. That's Maple Hollow in a sentence, though, at least back then. Gary wasn't feared exactly, he was tolerated. And tolerated, it turns out, is a status that can curdle into something much worse if nobody ever tells the person holding it no. He'd had, by my best guess, at least one other family's worth of practice before he ever got to us. I didn't know that yet, I just knew we were about to become the second family who finally said no out loud. By August of 2021, Theo had discovered sidewalk chalk, and it became the center of his entire universe for about 6 weeks. He was 2.5, and his idea of art was dragging a fat purple stick across the concrete in front of our house in wide, wandering arcs while I sat on the porch steps with my coffee, half watching, half checking work email on my phone. It usually lasted 20 minutes before the August heat drove us both back inside. The first notice appeared on our mailbox on September 3rd. Typed, not handwritten, slid into a plastic sleeve and taped so it wouldn't blow away. Reminder: Section 4.2 of the Maple Hollow Community Guidelines prohibits permanent or semi-permanent alteration of common area sidewalks, including chalk markings, without prior written approval. I laughed the first time I read it, standing right there at the mailbox, genuinely assuming it was some kind of joke. Mark wasn't laughing when I brought it inside. "That's not from the HOA," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Look at the font, that's the same font as the recycling reminder Gary slid under our door in July." He was right. I hadn't noticed the first time. I called the property management company that technically administered the HOA on paper. The woman who answered sounded tired in the specific way of someone who'd had this exact conversation more than once before. Sidewalk chalk isn't a permanent alteration, she said. It washes off in the rain, ma'am. That's not something we'd enforce. I told her about the notice anyway. She sighed not unkindly. Mr. Prout does sometimes interpret the guidelines a little generously. I'll make a note in the file. I didn't push it further than that. Here's the rationalization I made, the first of what would become dozens over the next 5 years, each one nearly identical. He's just a particular retired man with too much time on his hands, and it costs me nothing to let this go. I told myself that not escalating was the mature choice, the choice a reasonable adult makes. I had a toddler who didn't sleep through the night yet and a growing caseload at the clinic, and this, a chalk drawing, was not going to be the hill I picked to stand on. What I didn't say out loud, not even to Mark, was that some small, quiet part of me was already a little afraid of Gary. Not physically. Just the sense, even that early, that he was watching, cataloging, keeping a file somewhere in his head, waiting patiently for the next thing to write down. There was a second notice that same fall, smaller, almost forgettable except for what it taught me about how Gary operated. In November, he left a note about our leaf pile. We'd raked our yard into a single mound at the curb, waiting for the city's scheduled pickup 2 days later, which was standard practice on every other lawn on the block that same week. His note cited premature curbside yard waste accumulation creating an unsightly common area condition. I actually walked the street that afternoon half out of curiosity and counted 4 other leaf piles at 4 other curbs, none of which received a note. I didn't say anything about that discrepancy to anyone at the time. I just filed it away, the way you file away a small, uncomfortable fact you're not yet ready to build an argument out of. By April of 2022, Ivy was 3 months old and I was back at the clinic part-time, running on maybe 5 broken hours of sleep most nights, the kind of exhaustion that makes every small conflict feel enormous. Mark set up a portable basketball hoop at the end of our driveway for Theo, who just turned 3 and was mostly interested in carrying the ball around under one arm rather than actually shooting it. Gary's complaint that time went through the official channel, an actual HOA violation letter, $75, citing unauthorized recreational equipment extending into the community right-of-way. The hoop's plastic base sat, by my own measurement with a tape measure that afternoon, 18 inches onto the grass strip between our driveway and the street. 18 inches. I went and talked to him myself that time, standing in his driveway on one side of that perfect diagonal mow line while he stood on the other, like there was an invisible border between us. I asked him, as evenly as sleep deprivation allowed, why he'd reported a basketball hoop. "It's not personal, Dana," he said, arms folded, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "If I let it slide for you, I have to let it slide for everyone, and pretty soon the whole street looks like a parking lot for toys. You understand?" He smiled a little when he said the next part. "Family takes care of the neighborhood the way the neighborhood takes care of the family." I remember that line specifically because it sounded so reasonable in the moment, standing there exhausted with a nursing baby crying inside the house, and so strange later, turning it over that night while I fed her at 2 in the morning. Family takes care of the neighborhood. We weren't his family, we'd lived there 10 months. We paid the $75. Mark moved the hoop 6 inches closer to the garage. Gary never mentioned it again, and at the time I took his silence as proof this had really, truly been about the rule and not about us specifically. I was wrong about that, I just didn't have the proof yet. What I remember most from that particular week actually wasn't the fine at all. It was a conversation with Mark that night after the kids were finally down, both of us sitting on the edge of our bed too tired to actually get under the covers. "It's $75, he said. "It's not worth the fight." And I agreed with him genuinely at the time. $75 really wasn't worth a fight, neither was a basketball hoop. Neither on their own were sidewalk chalk or a porch light left on an hour too late. That was the trap of it, though I couldn't have named it as a trap yet. Every single individual ask Gary made was small enough to seem unreasonable to fight over, and small enough that fighting over it would have made me look like the unreasonable one. It's a strange kind of arithmetic. $75 repeated enough times in enough different forms over enough years adds up to something much larger than $75. but you can't see that sum while you're still standing inside the first small number. There was a second incident that same year I want to mention, smaller, almost not worth including except that it shows how granular this got. In November, a notice appeared citing our porch light as a recurring nighttime disturbance affecting adjacent property's viewshed, because we'd started leaving it on past 10 p.m. For a few weeks while Mark traveled for a work project and I didn't love coming home in the dark alone with 2 kids. No fine that time, just the notice. I remember standing in the kitchen reading it and feeling something shift slightly, not proof of anything, just a low, persistent hum of unease that I still didn't have a name for. I don't want you to think those first years were only this. Carol Pruitt, in her own quiet way, became something close to a friend during that stretch. She'd bring vegetables from her garden most summers, too many zucchini always, the way every gardener's zucchini seems to multiply past all reason. And she'd sit on our porch steps sometimes in the evenings while Theo showed her whatever chalk masterpiece he'd made that day, genuinely delighted by it in a way Gary never once was. She never once brought up his complaints. For a long time I thought that was loyalty. I understand now it was closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of living 30 years with someone whose certainty you've stopped having the energy to argue with. I remember one evening in particular, the summer Ivy turned 2, when Carol stayed on our porch long after the zucchini had been handed over, watching the kids chase fireflies in the fading light, and she said, almost to herself, I always wanted the house to feel this loud. Gary likes it quiet. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask her to. But I thought about that sentence often in the years that followed, the quiet admission, tucked into an otherwise ordinary evening, that somewhere underneath 30 years of matching lawns and diagonal mow lines, she'd wanted something different than what she'd ended up with. There was also Priya Nair, 2 streets over, a family law attorney and the mother of a boy Theo's age. We met at a neighborhood ice cream truck gathering in the summer of 2022. Both of us standing off to the side of the actual line because our toddlers had lost interest in ice cream and were instead trying to climb the same low retaining wall. Mine's going to break an arm on that thing eventually, Priya said, not moving to stop him, and something about her calm, unbothered honesty made me laugh out loud for what felt like the first time in weeks. We became fast, easy friends after that, the kind of friendship where you can text, "Is it insane that I'm crying in my car in the Target parking lot right now?" and get back a real answer within 2 minutes instead of a string of empty sympathy. She'd mention Gary occasionally, in passing in those early years. He left a note about our recycling bin too, don't take it personally. And I remember feeling almost comforted by the idea that this was just something Gary did to everyone equally, a personality quirk spread evenly across the street rather than something aimed. I didn't know yet how much I'd eventually come to lean on her, or how wrong that early comfort would turn out to be. There's one more incident from 2022 worth telling, because it's the first time I remember another adult on the street saying something out loud in our defense. We threw Theo a 3rd birthday party that September, a modest backyard gathering, maybe 15 people total counting kids, running from 2 in the afternoon until 5. At 4:40, Gary called the non-emergency police line to report excessive noise from a gathering exceeding typical residential capacity, specifically citing what he estimated as approximately 20 vehicles parked along the curb, though an actual count, which Mark did that evening out of frustration, came to 11. No citation resulted. The responding officer took one look at a yard full of balloons and a bounce house and left within 2 minutes, visibly unbothered. But Doug, from the corner house who'd been at the party, caught up with Gary in his own driveway the next morning and said, loud enough that 2 other neighbors heard it, "Gary, it was a kid's birthday party." It ended at 5 o'clock. Gary's response, according to Doug, was that he had a right to a peaceful Saturday afternoon, same as anyone. Doug told me about it over the fence a few days later, shaking his head. "I don't know what his deal is," he said, "but that felt personal." I remember agreeing with him out loud and privately filing the word personal away somewhere I wasn't ready to look at directly yet. By the spring of 2023, Theo was 4 and Ivy was 1. And for Theo's birthday, Mark's parents bought us a trampoline with a full safety net enclosure. We set it up in the backyard, which faces the woods, nowhere near the street, nowhere near anything Gary could plausibly see from his own property without walking around the block specifically to look. The violation notice that time came from Delaware County directly, not the HOA, a code enforcement complaint alleging our trampoline exceeded the required setback from the rear property line. The fine attached was $340. When the county inspector actually came out, measured the distance twice, and shook his head, he told us the setback was fine, well within code. Somebody really wanted this one looked at, he said, almost apologetic in a tone that told me he already had a guess about who. I asked Gary directly that time, standing on his own porch, whether he'd been the one to file it. He didn't deny it. He didn't even pretend to consider denying it. Setbacks exist for drainage reasons, he said, like he was reading from a manual. It's not about you specifically. I'd report anyone's trampoline in that spot. Ivy is one, Gary, I said. She can't even climb the ladder yet. Theo's 4. He looked at me for a second like the ages of my children were an entirely separate topic from the one we were having. The setback isn't about the kids' ages, he said. It's about drainage. And that was the whole conversation, really two people talking past each other with two completely different definitions of what the problem was. I walked back home that afternoon with $340 due in 10 days and the strange, sinking sense that I'd just lost an argument I hadn't fully realized I was having. Here's a thing I want to name clearly right now, because it's the whole mechanism of what Gary did for years and it deserves to be said out loud instead of just felt. That's the machinery of it. You take a private grudge and dress it up in a neutral, defensible, bylaw-shaped justification, and you never once have to admit what you actually want. Every complaint had its own tidy explanation. A hoop 18 inches too far, a trampoline near a setback line. Chalk that technically counted as an alteration, a porch light left on too late. Every single incident taken alone looked like almost nothing, the kind of thing you'd feel a little silly getting genuinely upset about. You'd have to step back incident by incident, year by year to see the actual shape underneath it. And for a long time I didn't have the distance or the proof, or honestly the permission I was waiting for from somewhere to let myself see it. There's one more incident from that same year worth including because it shows how Gary's methods had started to shift by 2023 from individual complaints to something closer to quiet political maneuvering. That June, the HOA board proposed a minor bylaw amendment that would have required board approval, rather than any single resident's discretion, before a formal violation notice could be issued to a homeowner. It was a small, sensible change, the kind of thing that mostly exists to stop exactly what Gary had been doing to us for 2 years running. Gary showed up to that meeting too, of course, and spoke against it for nearly 10 minutes, framing it as government overreach into neighbors simply looking out for neighbors. He didn't mention us by name. He didn't have to. The amendment failed 17-12, mostly because most residents didn't think it was worth the argument it would take to pass. The same calculation I'd been making myself at a smaller scale for 2 years. I remember sitting in the back of that meeting, not yet ready to speak up, watching him work the room with the same calm, reasonable-sounding logic he used on me in his driveway and thinking, he's good at this. He's had practice. I didn't yet know how literally true that was. One more from that same year, small on its own but worth including for what it revealed. That August, Carol had helped me put in 2 raised garden beds along the side of our house, a project she genuinely enjoyed, spending several evenings that summer showing me how to stagger tomato plants for better airflow. Gary filed a complaint about the beds too, citing unapproved structural additions altering the uniform landscaping aesthetic of the block, even though, as it turned out, 3 other households on Larkspur Court had raised garden beds of their own, none of which had ever been reported. When I pointed that out to the property manager on the phone, she paused and said, carefully, "I'll be honest, Mrs. Whitfield, we've had more complaints filed against your address in the last 2 years than the rest of the street combined." I don't have an explanation for that pattern, but I wanted you to know I've noticed it too. It was the first time anyone official had said out loud that there was a pattern at all, not proof of anything yet, not evidence I could act on, but confirmation that I wasn't imagining the shape of it. I remember hanging up the phone and standing in my kitchen for a long moment, feeling something between relief and dread settle into my chest at the same time. If any of this is sounding familiar to you, if you've had your own version of Gary, someone who used the rules as a weapon instead of a guide, who made you feel like the unreasonable one for simply existing at a normal volume, I want to hear about it in the comments below. I really do read them. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the moment, because the next part of this story is where it stops being annoying and starts being frightening. October 2024. Theo was 7 by then. It was a Tuesday evening, still light out around 6:45, and he was in the front yard with 2 kids from down the street playing a loose, shrieking, wonderful game of tag while I stood on the porch half watching, half scrolling through a work email about a scheduling conflict. This is, I want to note plainly, an entirely ordinary way for a 7-year-old to spend a Tuesday evening in early autumn. At 6:52, a Delaware County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up along our curb, lights on but no siren. The deputy who stepped out was young, maybe 26, and visibly uncomfortable with the call he'd been sent on. He explained, a little apologetically, that dispatch had received a report of a group of unsupervised minors creating a disturbance on Larkspur Court. "I'm right here," I told him, gesturing at myself, standing maybe 30 feet from where the kids had frozen mid-game, all 3 of them suddenly very quiet and very small-looking. "I've been out here this whole time." He nodded, clearly sensing already that the call had been thin at best. He asked a few routine questions. Was I their mother? Did I know the other kids' parents? Had there been any incidents? And left within 4 minutes, telling me on his way out that everything looked fine. But Theo had gone pale, and still the second those lights caught his face, the way kids do when they intuit, long before they can articulate it, that something about them has just been treated as a problem to be handled. He asked me that night in the bath, quiet, watching the water instead of me, did I do something bad? One of the other mothers whose son had been playing tag with Theo that evening, a woman named Kristen from a few houses down, texted me later that night, clearly rattled herself. "I've never had a cop show up because my kid was playing outside," she wrote. "That's insane. Are you okay?" I told her I was fine, mostly out of habit, the same reflexive smoothing over I'd been doing for 3 years by then. She wrote back a minute later, "For what it's worth, I don't think that call came from a stranger." I didn't respond to that part. I just said goodnight and put my phone face down on the counter, not ready yet to let anyone else say out loud what I still wasn't letting myself fully believe. I told him no. I told him some grown-ups get confused sometimes about what's actually dangerous and what isn't. I said it lightly, the way you're supposed to, so he wouldn't carry it forward with him. But I carried it. I lay awake a long time that night with a feeling I hadn't let myself fully name until then. This had never really been about noise or setbacks or chalk. This was about making my children feel surveilled inside their own front yard. I did the thing I'd been doing for 3 years running by that point. I let it go. I told myself the deputy hadn't even filed anything formal. I told myself that escalating with Gary would only make our daily life on that street harder, and we weren't planning to move, and conflict avoidance had, up until that point, always felt like the responsible, grown-up choice, the choice a good neighbor makes. What's the alternative, I asked myself, lying there in the dark? Become the family everyone on Larkspur Court quietly says is at war with the old man 2 doors down. That question, who does that make me, was doing more work in me than I understood at the time. I was so afraid of becoming the difficult one that I kept absorbing whatever Gary handed me instead, one incident at a time, and calling it patience. I want to pause here again because I think it matters. That same fall after the cruiser, Carol showed up at our door one evening with a casserole dish she didn't need to bring, and she sat with me at the kitchen table while the kids watched a show in the other room, and she said quietly, almost like she was testing whether it was safe to say at all, "I saw the police car." "I'm sorry, Dana." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. It was the first time in 3 years she'd acknowledged, even obliquely, that something wasn't right. I held on to that longer than I probably should have, as a kind of proof that not everyone on that street had gone along with it. One more incident from that same stretch, early winter of 2024, a couple of months after the cruiser. Mark and I had a small section of privacy fencing installed along the side yard, mostly so Ivy, then 3 and newly mobile in the destructive, delighted way 3-year-olds are, couldn't wander toward the street while we were both busy in the backyard. We checked the property survey ourselves twice before the installers came out. The fence sat entirely within our own lot. Gary disputed the property line anyway, citing an old plat map from 1998 that, as it turned out when the county eventually pulled the actual recorded survey, had never been updated after a minor lot line adjustment made when the subdivision was resurveyed in 2003. It took 6 weeks and a $210 survey fee, which we paid ourselves just to settle it and move on, to confirm what we'd already known. The fence was ours to build, exactly where we'd built it. I was going off the old map, Gary said when the county's finding came back. Not an apology. Just an explanation delivered with the same even reasonable tone he used for everything, as though being technically, procedurally wrong about where our property line sat was simply an honest clerical oversight rather than the 5th or 6th time in 3 years his oversights had cost us money and time. I remember standing in our kitchen that evening, looking at the $210 receipt, and thinking, not for the first time, but maybe the first time I let myself really sit inside the thought instead of brushing past it. How many honest mistakes does one person get to make before they stop being honest mistakes and start being something else entirely? In early February of 2025, about 5 weeks before the CPS visit, we received a certified letter, not from the HOA this time, but from a small law firm in Delaware County, on Gary's behalf, alleging that our side yard drainage was causing water damage to his property and threatening formal legal action if it wasn't remediated within 30 days. We hired our own contractor at a cost of $650 to inspect the grading between our 2 lots. The report came back unambiguous. Water on Gary's side of the property flowed toward his own downspout, not toward ours, and there was no evidence of cross-property drainage of any kind. We sent the report to his attorney. We never heard anything further about it. At the time, I remember feeling a strange, exhausted relief that it had simply gone away. The way so many of these things had over the years, a flare of alarm, a scramble to respond, and then silence, as if the goal had never really been to win the specific complaint at all, only to make us spend money and time and worry defending against it. Looking back now, I think that's exactly what it was. I think the letter wasn't really about drainage any more than the trampoline had been about setbacks. I think by February, Gary and his son were simply running out of patience for how long reasonable time was taking, and testing which pressure, applied where, might finally push us toward the decision they'd been waiting years for us to make on our own. By the spring of 2025, I'd let myself believe foolishly that we'd reached some kind of plateau. Fewer notices, no more police visits, months at a time where I almost forgot to brace myself walking past his driveway. There was a smaller incident that same February, only a few weeks before the CPS call, that I didn't think much of at the time, but that makes a lot more sense to me now. Gary stopped Mark in the driveway one evening and mentioned, almost conversationally, that property values on Larkspur Court had really taken off that year, and that he'd heard through a friend in real estate that older homes like ours, the original 2003-era builds, were starting to look a little dated compared to what's going up new. Mark mentioned it to me that night as a strange, slightly awkward exchange, nothing more. Neither of us thought, even for a second, that we were being quietly assessed for a sale we hadn't yet decided to make. I think about that conversation often now, how ordinary it sounded, how completely it fit into the texture of an unremarkable Tuesday, and how it was, in hindsight, one more small piece of a plan already well underway. On March 14th, a Friday, I came home from a long shift at the clinic to find a woman from Delaware County Children's Services standing on my porch with a clipboard and a laminated county ID clipped to her jacket. She introduced herself calmly and explained that her office had received an anonymous report alleging that our children, ages 4 and 8 by then, were regularly left to roam the neighborhood unsupervised, in conditions suggestive of neglect. I want to try to describe what that does to a person because I don't think shock quite covers it. My hands went cold, actually cold, standing there in 70-degree weather. My first instinct wasn't even anger. It was a kind of humiliated dread, the fear that even a completely false accusation could somehow attach itself to us permanently, follow us, show up in some file somewhere forever, the way these things sometimes do regardless of how untrue they are. The caseworker was kind about it, to her credit. She did a brief walkthrough, watched Theo show her his Lego dinosaur collection with the same earnest pride he showed everyone, watched Ivy toddle over with a picture book, and told me within about 20 minutes that she saw absolutely no cause for concern and that the case would be closed as unfounded. But she also said something else on her way out, almost as an aside, pausing at her car door. For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitfield, these anonymous calls almost always come from somebody close by. You might want to think carefully about who'd have a reason to make one. I already knew, I think I'd known somewhere underneath for a long time. For nearly 2 weeks after that, I didn't do anything. I went through the motions: work, school pickup, dinner, the strange new vigilance of watching my own children play in their own yard and feeling, for the first time, genuinely watched myself the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. Mark wanted to go straight to Gary's door that same night. I asked him not to, not yet. I still didn't have proof of anything. I had a pattern I could feel in my chest but couldn't yet lay out flat for anyone else to see. The proof found us almost by accident, the way these things so often seem to. In late March, Gary asked Mark to help him carry some boxes down from the garage rafters. He was planning what he called a proper cleanout ahead of a spring yard sale. Mark, who has never once in the 4 years I've known Gary been anything but relentlessly, almost stubbornly neighborly, said yes without hesitation. While the two of them were shifting boxes off a high shelf, one slid open on its own and a manila folder slipped out onto the concrete garage floor. Mark told me later he almost didn't even glance down at it. But the tab, in Gary's small, precise handwriting, read. Inside were photographs, dated and printed, going back all the way to 2021, the chalk on the sidewalk, the basketball hoop, the trampoline from 3 separate angles, even a single photo of our porch light glowing past what Gary had apparently privately decided was a reasonable hour. There were printouts of the HOA bylaws with entire sections highlighted in yellow marker. And clipped to the very front of the folder, a handwritten log, not of complaints this time, but of comparable home sale prices for every house on Larkspur Court going back 3 years, with our address circled twice in blue ink. Underneath, that was a printed text message thread. Gary's son, Ryan Pruitt, works as a real estate agent about 40 minutes away in a suburb Mark and I had honestly never had reason to think about once. The messages were dated from that January, 5 months before the garage sale, 3 months before the false CPS report. Mark read them standing right there on the concrete floor before quietly, carefully, putting the folder back exactly where it had come from and saying nothing to Gary at all. Ryan, any movement on 214? Still think it'd list fast if they got tired of the fines. Gary, give it time, they're not the type to fight. I just need one more real complaint on record before spring. Ryan, haha, you're a menace lol. Keep me posted, I'll get it under asking before it ever hits MLS if they're motivated. Mark told me all of this standing in our kitchen with his coat still on, keys still in his hand, like he hadn't been able to make himself sit down before saying it out loud. I put the box back exactly how it was, he said. I didn't say anything to him. I helped him finish carrying the rest of the boxes down and I said thanks for the coffee and I left. His voice was strange, flat in a way I wasn't used to hearing from him. Dana, he had our address labeled in a folder in his garage like we were a case file. Are you sure it was recent? I asked, even though some part of me already knew the answer, the way you ask a question you don't actually want contradicted. The texts were from January, he said. 3 months ago, there's a date stamp at the top of the message thread. He finally sat down across from me at the table and for a second neither of us said anything at all. I keep thinking about the trampoline, he said eventually. I actually apologized to him for the trampoline being an inconvenience. I remember doing that. I felt bad. I didn't have anything better to offer him in that moment than reaching across the table and putting my hand over his. We sat like that for a while, the coffee he still hadn't touched going cold between us, both of us quietly recalculating 5 years of small, reasonable-sounding interactions in light of what we now knew they'd actually been. I want to sit with that exchange for a second, the way I had to sit with it myself that night after Mark finally told me, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he never actually drank from. This had never, not for one single year, been about chalk or setbacks or noise complaints or porch lights. Gary had been building a paper trail, patient, methodical, meticulously dated for close to 5 years, specifically so that when we finally got tired enough to sell, his son could get to us first, before our house ever reached the open market and buy it under value. 5 years of typed notices in plastic sleeves, 5 years of my son flinching at the sight of police lights in his own front yard, not a grudge in the end, a business plan with a lawn. I didn't cry when Mark told me, which surprised me at the time because I'd have expected to. I remember sitting very still at that kitchen table for a long time, turning my own coffee mug in a slow half-circle on the wood, feeling something in me go quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in years. It wasn't rage, exactly, not yet. It was clarity. The specific, almost peaceful kind of clarity that arrives right before you finally stop asking yourself whether something is really as bad as you've suspected it was. There was one more document in that folder I haven't mentioned yet, near the very back, that I keep returning to even now. It was a printed real estate listing sheet, unfinished, a template Ryan had apparently started filling in early, our address at the top, a projected list price penciled in beneath it in Gary's handwriting, a number nearly $40,000 below what our house was actually worth on the open market that spring. Beside it in the margin, a single handwritten note, ask before June whether's good for showings. I remember reading that and thinking about the leaf pile from 4 years earlier, the one uncounted note among 4 identical piles on the same street. It hadn't been random. None of it had ever been random. It had all just been steps in a sequence I hadn't known I was standing inside of until I could finally see the whole thing laid out on a garage floor. I also thought that same night about Carol and about the Kowalskis, the family 2 streets over who'd sold in a hurry 3 years before we ever moved in. I didn't have proof connecting that sale to any of this. I want to be honest about that, I still don't, but I understood, sitting at that table, that we very likely weren't the first family Gary had ever done this to. We were just the first one who happened to find the folder. The week between finding that folder and calling Priya was, in a lot of ways, harder than any of the 5 years before it. I went to work each day and treated kids recovering from spinal surgeries and hip dysplasia and told myself correctly that whatever I was carrying at home was smaller than what some of those families were carrying. I came home each evening and made dinner and helped with homework and gave baths and read the same 3 books Ivy insisted on every single night. And underneath all of it, I kept replaying that text thread in my head, give it time, they're not the type to fight, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath it. Mark and I didn't talk about it much that first week, oddly. We both needed a little time to just sit with what we now knew before we could talk about what to do with it. I remember one night, close to midnight, both of us lying awake in the dark not saying anything until he finally said quietly, I keep thinking about how confident he sounded. Like it was just business. I didn't have anything to say back to that right away. I just reached over and found his hand in the dark, and we lay there a while longer before either of us fell asleep. I called Priya the next morning before my shift, sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot with the engine off and the windows fogging up slightly in the cold. I told her everything, the folder, the photographs, the text thread. 5 years compressed into about 6 minutes of talking faster than I usually let myself talk. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said something I've turned over in my mind more times than I could count since. Dana, you know none of this was ever really about the rules, right? I think you've known that for years, you just haven't given yourself permission yet to actually believe it. That sentence undid something in me, sitting there in that cold car, because she was right. I had known on some level since the basketball hoop, maybe even since the mosquito comment over the lemon bars. I just kept searching year after year, for a reason it might not be as calculated as it felt, because the alternative, that a grown man had spent half a decade quietly trying to engineer my family's exit from our own home, was so much more exhausting to sit inside than doubt had been. Priya, in her professional capacity as a family law attorney, walked me through exactly what we actually had on paper: a 5-year documented pattern of retaliatory, pretextual code and HOA complaints. At least one confirmed false report to a state child welfare agency, which, depending on jurisdiction and intent, can itself carry real legal consequences of its own. And now, sitting in that manila folder in a garage 2 doors down, direct written evidence of financial motive. This isn't just an annoying neighbor anymore, Dana, she said, gently but very plainly. This is something you can genuinely act on now, but it has to be your call how. She laid out over the course of that call and a longer conversation a few days later, roughly 3 paths open to us. We could pursue a civil claim, which she was willing to help us think through, but which she was honest would likely take a year or more and cost more in stress than most people expect going in. We could report the false CPS complaint to the county for review, which carried its own consequences for Gary, but wouldn't necessarily touch the deeper pattern underneath it. Or we could do what she called the slower, more public option, build the full record ourselves and bring it somewhere it couldn't be quietly managed behind closed doors, like an HOA meeting, where the accountability wouldn't come from a courtroom but from an entire community finally seeing the same picture at once. That one won't get you damages, she told me. But in my experience, it's often the one that actually stops the behavior because it takes away the thing people like this depend on most, nobody else in the room knowing what they know. I chose that third path almost immediately without much deliberation, and I think that tells you something about what I actually wanted out of all of this. I didn't want Gary's money. I didn't especially want him punished in some formal legal sense, though I wouldn't have objected if it had gone that way. I wanted the pattern seen. I wanted every person on that street who'd quietly wondered, the way Doug apparently had for years, to stop wondering and start knowing. That same week, I also talked to my own mother on the phone one evening after the kids were in bed, mostly because I needed to hear the whole thing out loud to someone entirely outside the situation, someone with no stake in Maple Hollow's fragile little social order. She listened without interrupting once, which for her is its own kind of restraint, and when I finished she said in her plain, unbothered way, "You've spent 5 years being the reasonable one so nobody could ever say you started something. Baby, you don't owe anybody your silence as proof of your good character. You never did." Here is the part of this story I feel most obligated to be honest about, because I think it's the part a lot of stories like this one tend to skip over. Underneath the anger, underneath even the sharp, protective fear I felt for my kids, there was a smaller, more embarrassing fear I hadn't said out loud yet to anyone, not even to Mark, not even to Priya. It was this: if I stop quietly absorbing this, if I stop being the calm, easy, non-confrontational neighbor everyone on that street has always found convenient to have around, who am I to this place? Who am I to anyone if I'm not the person who makes things easy? I'd built a kind of identity, without ever consciously choosing to, around being the one who didn't cause problems not just with Gary, but going back much further than that to my whole life. The sibling who never picked a fight at a family dinner. The employee who never once pushed back on an unfair shift schedule, even when it meant missing Ivy's first pediatrician appointment. The friend who always said, "It's fine, honestly, don't worry about it," even when it very much wasn't fine. Somewhere along the way, I had started to believe, without ever examining it, that my worth to the people around me was tied directly to how little friction I created for them. Gary hadn't invented that fear in me. He'd simply found it already sitting there ready-made, and used it expertly and almost effortlessly for 5 straight years, without ever once having to raise his voice or say a single outright unkind word to my face. Sitting with that realization was its own kind of confrontation, separate from, and honestly harder than, the one still ahead of me. I had to ask myself, seriously, what it would actually cost me to finally stop being agreeable about something that had never once been reasonable to begin with. And when I really asked it, sitting alone at my kitchen table late one night with the folder Mark had photographed open on my laptop screen, I had to admit that the cost, being seen by a man who had spent 5 years quietly trying to force my family out of our own home, as difficult, was not really a cost at all. It was just the truth, finally being allowed to look like exactly what it had always been. I decided 2 things that week sitting there. First, that I would document everything myself properly, the way Gary had, build my own binder, my own timeline, my own case, so nothing I said could be waved away as one upset mother's feelings. Second, that I would not do this quietly in a private conversation on his driveway where he could smile, deflect, and control the room the way he always had for 5 years running. I would do it somewhere he couldn't manage the outcome, somewhere other people would be sitting close enough to hear every word. I also talked to a coworker that week, a nurse practitioner at the clinic named Renata, who'd mentioned once, months earlier, almost in passing, that she dealt with something similar with a landlord years before, not the same situation exactly, but the same underlying shape of it, someone using paperwork and process as a way to make her feel like the unstable one while quietly working an angle underneath. We were in the break room and I hadn't planned to bring it up, but it came out anyway between patients in fragments over 2 cups of bad coffee. She listened all the way through without once interrupting, which surprised me because Renata is not naturally a quiet person. "You know what got me through mine," she said finally, "was realizing the goal was never actually to make him behave better. Some people don't have that in them. The goal was to make it impossible for him to keep doing it to me, specifically in the dark where nobody else could see the pattern. She said it so plainly, stirring her coffee, that it took me a second to feel the full weight of it. It wasn't really about changing Gary. It never had been. It was about ending the specific arrangement where he got to keep doing this to my family quietly, one thin, defensible complaint at a time, while everyone around us, including me, kept assuming there had to be a reasonable explanation somewhere underneath it. That distinction mattered more to me than almost anything else anyone said to me that whole month. I wasn't trying to win Gary over or make him see us differently or earn some kind of overdue apology out of him. I didn't need him to become a different person. I just needed the machinery to stop running. There was a night that week, too, that I haven't told very many people about, where I sat on the edge of Theo's bed after he'd fallen asleep and just watched him for a long time, the particular stillness kids have when they're finally fully at rest, none of the day's small worries visible on their faces anymore. I thought about the cruiser lights catching his face in October and the way he'd asked me, quietly in the bathtub, whether he'd done something bad. I thought about how easily an 8-year-old absorbs the idea that being watched means being wrong. And I made a decision sitting there in the dark that had less to do with Gary specifically and more to do with what I wanted Theo and Ivy to eventually understand about how a person is supposed to respond when they're being treated unfairly by someone with more perceived authority than them. I wanted them to see me hold a boundary calmly, without shouting, without disappearing into it either. I didn't fully realize until that night how much of this decision was actually being made for them, more than for me. There was also something quieter happening between Mark and me that whole month, underneath the practical planning, a kind of recalibration in our own partnership that I hadn't expected. Mark had spent 5 years being the one who said it's not worth the fight almost as often as I'd said it myself, and I think finding that folder in his own hands in Gary's own garage hit him differently than it would have if I'd simply told him about it secondhand. He apologized to me one night that week, unprompted, for all the times he'd talked me into paying a fine or moving a hoop instead of pushing back harder. I told him he didn't need to apologize. We'd both been doing the same math, both of us weighing the exhausting cost of a fight against the fixable-seeming cost of a fine over and over for years. But I understood what he meant, and something between us settled a little more evenly after that conversation. The two of us finally standing on the same side of a decision instead of one of us quietly managing the other's exhaustion. Mark, for his part, was ready to go to war the moment we found the folder, and I understood that instinct completely. It's the same instinct I'd have had toward anyone who threatened him. But I asked him more than once that week to let me set the pace on this one because I needed it to be something I chose deliberately, on my own timeline rather than something that happened to me a second time, even if this second time was in our own defense. He agreed, though I could tell it cost him something to wait. "Just tell me when," he said. "I'll be right there." That, more than almost anything else that spring, is what let me actually walk into that clubhouse in April feeling steady instead of afraid. The Maple Hollow HOA's annual spring meeting was scheduled for the second Tuesday in April at the community clubhouse, open to any resident who wanted to attend. Gary never once missed it in 4 years. Neither, starting that spring, would I. The clubhouse held about 40 folding chairs, and by 7 o'clock on the evening of April 8th, most of them were full, the ordinary business of an HOA meeting droning along first, mailbox paint colors, pool hours for the summer, a mildly contentious proposal about repaving the walking trail around the retention pond. Gary sat in his usual spot, front row, left side, notebook open on his knee purely out of habit, the way some people can't sit through a meeting without a pen in hand. I'd asked Walt, the board president, a soft-spoken man who clearly had no idea what was coming, for 5 minutes under new business. He gave it to me with a slightly nervous nod, glancing between me and Gary like he already sensed something was about to shift in the room. I stood up with a binder in my hands, not dramatic, not oversized, plain black, 3 rings carefully tabbed. I'd built it over 2 weeks with Priya's help. Late at night after the kids were asleep. Every single violation notice Gary had filed against us since September of 2021, laid out chronologically, cross-referenced next to the actual unedited bylaw text he'd claimed to be enforcing, showing in plain black and white how thin or simply incorrect most of those citations had actually been. After that, the police call log from October 2024. After that, the County Children's Services letter, closed as unfounded, dated and signed from that March. And last of all, copies. Mark had quietly photographed the folder in the garage the same week we found it, before we'd raised a single word about any of this to Gary, of the text thread between him and his son. I read the messages aloud, not loudly. I never once raised my voice that whole night. I didn't need to. The room did that work for me. I could hear it happening in real time, chairs creaking as people turned in their seats to look at Gary instead of me, a low murmur moving down the rows like weather. I'm not here tonight to ask this board to punish anyone, I said, keeping my voice level the way I'd practiced twice in my car that same afternoon. I'm here because for 5 years, every single time my family was fined, reported, or investigated by an actual county agency, I assumed it was ultimately about rules. I want everyone in this room tonight to understand clearly that it was never once about rules. It was about my house's future resale value and someone else's real estate commission. Before Gary said anything, I read 2 more entries from the binder, the leaf pile from 2021. With a photograph I'd taken that same week showing 3 other unsighted piles along the same block. And the county's own letter confirming our fence had always sat correctly on our property, the $210 survey receipt paperclipped behind it. I wasn't trying to bury him in detail. I wanted the room to see plainly that this wasn't one bad year or one misunderstanding. It was a shape that had held steady for half a decade, and shapes like that don't happen by accident. Gary stood up fast enough that his chair scraped hard against the tile, loud enough that a woman sitting beside him flinched visibly. This is a private family matter being dragged into an HOA meeting that has nothing to do with it, he said, his voice climbing in a way I'd genuinely never once heard from him in 4 years. You have absolutely no right. You filed a false report with Children's Services alleging neglect of my 4-year-old and my 8-year-old. I said, and I did not raise my voice to meet his, no matter how badly some old, tired part of me wanted to. I kept it flat and level, the way I'd rehearsed. That is not a private family matter, Gary. That is a matter of public record, and it is officially closed as unfounded, and I have the county's own letter right here in this binder if anyone in this room would like to see it for themselves. He opened his mouth to answer, and for the first time in 4 years, nothing came out. I watched something shift across his face that I had genuinely never seen on him before, not anger exactly, but something closer to being caught. The particular stillness of a man realizing in real time in front of 30-some of his own neighbors that the story he'd been quietly telling himself about himself for years did not survive being spoken out loud in that room. Walt, still holding the meeting's agenda in one hand, looked between the two of us for a long moment before he finally spoke. Gary, he said, quiet but firm in a way I don't think anyone in that room had heard from him before, is this true, the report to Children's Services, did you file that? Gary didn't answer directly. He looked instead at the folder of printed messages still open on the little podium in front of me, and something in his shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. I never wanted it to go that far, he said, and for the first time all night his voice had lost its edge entirely. The county thing. That wasn't, I told Ryan it was getting out of hand by February. He said one more complaint on record and it'd be done. He stopped himself like he'd heard what he was actually admitting to only after it left his mouth. A woman 2 rows back, a widow named Pat who lived on the street even longer than Gary had, said something under her breath I didn't quite catch, but I saw 2 other people nod along with whatever it was. I want to be honest that there was a version of that moment where I could have pushed harder, where I could have used his stumble to really take him apart in front of everyone. I didn't want to. Not because I'd suddenly forgiven him, I hadn't, and I still haven't fully, but because the point had already landed the moment Walt asked the question and Gary couldn't say no. I didn't need to win the room any further than I already had. I just needed the truth sitting out in the open where it couldn't be quietly folded back up again afterward. A man near the back, I didn't know him well, a newer resident named Frank who'd only moved onto Larkspur Court the previous fall, raised his hand and asked plainly whether Gary had ever done anything similar to other households on the street before us. Nobody answered right away. I saw Carol's eyes go to the floor. I saw 2 or 3 older residents exchange a glance that told me more than any direct answer could have. Walt cleared his throat and said, carefully, that the board would be reviewing the last several years of filed complaints going forward, to look for any patterns worth understanding better. It wasn't an accusation. It didn't need to be. Everyone in that room had just watched enough of a pattern get named out loud that they could fill in the rest themselves. Gary sat back down at some point during all of this. I don't remember exactly when, only that at a certain point he simply wasn't standing anymore, the fight gone out of him for the night. He didn't look at me again before the meeting moved on. I didn't need him to. I do want to give him one moment of real honesty because I don't think it's fair to leave him out of this story as a flat villain, even after everything. Toward the very end of the meeting, after the board had moved on to the walking trail vote and most people had stopped watching him, I saw him sitting there with his notebook still closed on his knee, staring at nothing in particular, and for just a second his face wasn't defensive or performative at all. It just looked old and tired and a little bewildered, like a man watching a version of himself get described by someone else and not fully recognizing it. I don't excuse anything he did, but I believe that moment was real, and I think some part of him, underneath 30 years of being the person who kept everyone else in line, genuinely hadn't expected to end up being the one the room turned to look at. Carol didn't say a single word the entire time it was happening, but afterward, out in the parking lot, under the flat white glow of the clubhouse security light, she found me by my car and her hands were visibly shaking a little as she spoke. I told him 3 years ago it had gone too far, she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. After the trampoline. I told him, he told me I didn't understand how business worked. She looked, standing there in that parking lot, less like an accomplice to any of it and more like someone who'd been living next door to this exact dynamic for far longer than I had, trapped in a smaller, quieter version of the very same thing. I believed her completely. I still do. The line I said that night, the one that people who were actually in that room still bring up sometimes when I run into them at the grocery store months later, was the one I closed with, right before I sat back down and let the meeting move on to the walking trail proposal like nothing at all had happened. You don't get to spend 5 years turning a rulebook into a weapon and call it looking out for the neighborhood. A community that has to be policed into looking a certain way isn't really a community at all. It's just a business plan with a lawn attached to it. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of room and it wasn't that kind of moment. But nobody looked away from me either, and for the first time in 5 years I didn't feel like the one who was being watched. Nothing about what followed resolved cleanly, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one do people a real disservice when they tie everything up into too neat a bow at the end. The HOA board voted about 3 weeks later to formally reprimand Gary in writing and to strip him of any informal enforcement role, a role that had never technically existed on paper to begin with, but which everyone on that street had for years quietly and unconsciously deferred to anyway. They also revised the noise and common area guidelines that same month, removing the vague, elastic language he'd relied on for years and replacing it with narrow, specific definitions that couldn't be stretched to cover sidewalk chalk or a porch light ever again. Walt personally called to walk me through the new language before it went out in the May newsletter, which I appreciated more than I let on at the time, a small, unglamorous kindness. Someone doing the quiet administrative work of making sure this couldn't happen again to the next family who moved in after us. The board also passed, almost as an afterthought at that same meeting, a new requirement that any resident filing more than 2 code or HOA complaints against the same household within a 12-month period would need to bring those complaints to the full board for review rather than filing them independently through the property manager. Nobody said Gary's name when they passed it. Nobody needed to. It was, in its own quiet bureaucratic way, the clearest acknowledgement the street ever gave that what had happened to us wasn't going to be allowed to happen again to anyone else. Gary never once apologized to me directly. Not that spring, not since, not even a version of it dressed up as something else. He and Mark still nod at each other across the street sometimes, the bare, minimal civility of two men who have lived 100 feet apart for 4 years and have to keep doing so. I don't expect that to ever change, and at some point this past summer, I noticed I genuinely stopped needing it too. Ryan Prout, as far as I know, still sells real estate 40 minutes away. I don't know whether he ever fully understood how close he came to picking up our house for less than it was worth. I've never once asked, and I've decided I don't particularly want to know. Carol changed in a small, quiet, genuinely real way. She still brings vegetables in the summer, more of them than ever, and now she stays longer on our porch steps than she used to, like something in her had been holding back for years and finally didn't have to anymore. Last month, almost in passing, while we were shelling peas at my kitchen table, she mentioned that she'd started going to the Tuesday coffee group at her church on her own for the first time in 31 years of marriage. She didn't make a bigger deal out of saying it than that. I didn't either. Some repairs happen quietly at the edges of a life without anyone ever announcing them out loud. There was a strange, quiet stretch in May, a few weeks after the meeting, where I kept waiting for some second wave of consequence I couldn't quite name, a retaliatory complaint, another anonymous call, something. It never came. I mentioned that to Priya once, almost sheepishly, admitting I still flinched a little every time a car slowed near our house. She told me that was a completely normal residue to carry for a while, that it takes time for a nervous system to believe a threat has actually ended just because the facts say it has. She was right. It took most of that summer before I stopped double-checking the driveway before letting the kids out front unsupervised for even 5 minutes. I also heard secondhand through Walt that Ryan Prout's brokerage received an informal complaint that sprang from someone else on the board who'd been at the meeting, not a legal filing, nothing that went anywhere official, just enough of a conversation that Ryan apparently stopped mentioning Larkspur Court to his father for a while. I don't know if that changed anything for him professionally. I've made my peace with not knowing. Doug from the corner house, the same man who'd half-joked years earlier about Gary running for the board, stopped by that June with a case of sparkling water and said, almost apologetically, "We all sort of knew, you know, not the real estate part." But we knew he leaned on people. Nobody wanted to be the one to say it first. I didn't hold that against him. I understood it, honestly, better than I would have 5 years earlier. I'd been the person hoping someone else would say it first for a long time, too. Something shifted more broadly on Larkspur Court that summer, too, in a way that was hard to point to any single cause for. Neighbors who'd kept mostly to themselves for years started showing up more often at the shared retention pond in the evenings. Kids from 3 or 4 different houses running around the little wooden footbridge together in a way I hadn't really seen since we first moved in. I don't think it was really about Gary at all in the end. I think it was more that an unspoken, low-level tension that had been sitting over that whole street for years. The sense that somebody was always watching for a reason to complain finally lifted, and people who'd been quietly avoiding attention for a long time started letting their guard down again, one ordinary Tuesday evening at a time. The part that means the most to me, honestly, out of everything, isn't anything that happened to Gary at all. It's Theo. 2 weeks ago, a new family moved into the house at the end of the court with a boy about Theo's age. Theo was out front within the hour, chalk in hand, showing the new kid exactly where the best shade fell on the sidewalk in the late afternoon. No hesitation in him at all. No glancing over his shoulder toward Gary's porch the way he used to, for months without ever fully realizing he was doing it. I stood at our front window and watched him laugh at something the new kid said, loud and completely unself-conscious. Chalk dust already on both his knees, and I thought, whatever else the last 5 years cost us, he got that particular piece of himself back. That's the part I'd fight the whole thing over again for if it ever came to it. Ivy, who's 5 now and mostly too young to remember any of the earlier years in real detail, has started a small ritual this summer of drawing a chalk sun on the sidewalk every morning before breakfast, rain or shine, sometimes drawing right over yesterday's faded one without a second thought. I never taught her to do that. She just started doing it on her own sometime in May, and I haven't asked her why, and I don't think I need to. Some things repair themselves in ways too small to explain and too important to interrupt. I did eventually tell Theo a simple, age-appropriate version of what had actually happened. Sometime that June, sitting on his bed one evening when he asked, out of nowhere, why Mr. Prout wasn't the boss of the street anymore. I told him that Mr. Prude had been unfair to our family for a long time, and that grown-ups sometimes use rules to be unkind instead of using them to be fair, and that I'd needed to stand up and say so clearly in front of other people before it would stop. He thought about that for a minute, cross-legged on his comforter, and then asked, "Were you scared?" I told him the truth, that I had been a little, but that being scared and doing the right thing anyway weren't opposites, they just happen at the same time sometimes. He nodded like that made complete sense to him, the way 8-year-olds can sometimes absorb something true faster and more simply than adults ever manage to. Priya and I got coffee together a few weeks after the meeting, the first time either of us had really talked through the whole thing start to finish in person without a crisis attached to the conversation. She asked me at one point whether I felt like I'd won. I remember sitting with that question longer than I expected to before answering. "I don't think winning is really the shape of it," I told her eventually. "I think I just finally stopped losing quietly." She nodded like that tracked completely with everything she'd watched me carry that spring, and we let the conversation move on from there to easier things. Her son's upcoming birthday, whether the neighborhood pool would reopen on schedule that summer, the ordinary texture of two friends catching up on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember being grateful sitting there for how normal it all felt. Normal had been in short supply for a long time. I keep coming back more than I probably should to something Priya said to me that morning in her office, before any of this quite had a name yet. "You don't owe anybody your silence as proof of your character." That's the line I'd most want anyone watching tonight to carry out of this with them, more than anything about Gary, more than the folder or the meeting or any single detail of what happened on Larkspur Court. Being agreeable is not the same thing as being good. In a community, or a family, or a marriage, or any friendship you've ever quietly kept the peace inside of that only holds itself together because one person keeps absorbing what should never have been asked of them in the first place isn't really peace at all. It's just a quieter, slower kind of cost, and it always gets paid eventually, by the one person everyone else has learned they can count on to keep paying it without complaint. I stopped paying for it, that in the end is the whole story. If this one hit close to home for you, I'd genuinely love to hear your version of it down in the comments. I read every single one, even the long ones. Share this with someone who's still quietly absorbing something they shouldn't have to be carrying alone, and if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe because there are a lot more stories like this one still to come. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.